Well, joining me to discuss this in our central London studio, Francis Beckett, author of What Did the Baby Boomers Ever Do for Us? And here in the studio, the journalist Wallis Simons. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us. Let's start with you, Francis. Given the title of your book, I don't think we really need to dig too deeply to discover your view on the matter. That post-war generation who never had it so good essentially stuffed it for the rest of us that followed.
It's not quite like that, but what we did was that we inherited the Attlee Settlement, which was a great civilising settlement of Britain's affair, which was to ensure that nobody need die of a treatable illness simply because they didn't have the money, that nobody need remain illiterate, unable to do the basic things because there would be a free education system, all of those things. We inherited that, and by and large, we trashed it. I thought your interviewees were very interesting, but the one thing that I feel that they misunderstood was that it's not a question of can we afford pensions or can we afford student fees. That's not the point. The point is that the mistakes that my generation made were mistakes of legislation, not of economics. What's happened to those two people that you were interviewing then was that the one of them was living in a deregulated housing market where young people are being exploited by rapacious landlords all over London. That's the problem that he's got. That's the housing problem that he's got. And it's not a problem to be counterposed as though somehow or another there are alternatives between being able to having pensions or having student grants. A civilized society can afford, and a rich society as we are, can afford both, but it can only do so if it has the will to.
But of course, Francis, and I'll be with you in just one second, but of course, Francis, these are an incredibly powerful voting bloc, well, certainly compared to 18 to 25-year-olds.
Well, they're not powerful enough, obviously, because if you're assuming that they're all going to vote against student in favour of both the rich, both the old and the young having reasonable treatment, they're not achieving it.
OK, Jake, defend the baby boomers. We have a situation at the moment where people can't afford to buy their own home, where they're having to shell out more in taxation to keep these people in the style to which they've become accustomed. What did they ever do for us?
Well, I mean, I don't buy this whole idea that it's all the baby boomers' fault. I mean, you know, Francis is a baby boomer, and I'm the son of baby boomers. And in some ways, I am cross about the fact that I have fewer opportunities than he did. But I don't blame his entire generation for it. I blame, the Blair Brown government for spending all of our money. I blame the global economic crash. But I don't blame
everyone who put stuff on their credit
boomer.
cards. Everyone who put stuff on their credit cards and took advantage of mortgages at ridiculously low rates. Those who were helped in the aftermath of the Second World War, put in a position where they could have children.
Well, that's right. But I think that overall, the baby boomers have done far more good than harm. I mean, if you take yourself back to the 1950s and think what it must have been like to have been a woman in the 1950s, to have been gay in the 1950s, to have been an ethnic minority in the 1950s, the baby boomers have transformed our society for the better and made a Britain that is a much better place for everybody to live in, notwithstanding the fact that, financially speaking, it's more tough for us these days. I certainly don't blame the whole generation for that.
Sure, Francis, it is undeniable that the sweeping social changes that we experienced since the 1960s, frankly, we wouldn't have had them if there hadn't been that post-war settlement which improved their lot immeasurably.
Yeah, I think Jake's absolutely right about the benefits that we've had from that period. That generation was able to create those benefits because it was the first economically free generation that Britain had ever known. It was the first time that teenagers actually had money in their pockets. It was the first time that going to university was not simply a prerogative of the rich, a privilege of the rich, that people with regional accents, people with not much money could go to university. It was the first time that education was perceived, school education even, was perceived as a right rather than a privilege of wealth. So yes, all of that happened all of that was created by the generation after the Second World War. What my generation did was to inherit it. And while it built on it in exactly the ways that Jake has described, it also trashed it in exactly the way that I have described. It threw away all the regulations on the housing market. It threw away the idea that you could go to university and you wouldn't have to pay for it, so that you didn't have to think about whether you could afford to go to university. The social composition of universities became... There were far more working class students at university when I was a student than there had ever been before. There are now far fewer. Now, I also agree with Jake that it's very largely the fault of the Blair-Brown government. Incidentally, the only baby boomer government that Britain has ever had or will ever have. Blair and Brown were the only two prime ministers Britain has ever had or will ever have who were actually baby boomers, Francis, actually members of my generation.
Francis, yes, I think I'd take issue with your idea that the baby boomer generation has simultaneously built on those achievements and trashed them. I mean, I'm not quite sure that really hangs together. I mean, the fact is that the baby boomers have created a society that is overall a much better place to be than it was in the 1950s.
No,
all governments make mistakes. We have had that little thing of a global economic crash to deal with. But I think that to blame an entire generation, as if there's a conspiracy theory of a small cabal of middle-aged people who are wanting to screw over the rest of the world, I think is rather absurd.
No, I don't think there's a small cabal of middle-aged people who wanted to screw over the rest of the world. For a start, the baby boom generation is very definitely not a small cabal. It's an extremely large cabal.
That doesn't make a difference.
What we did was not to decide to screw over the world. What we did was to fail to understand that all the benefits of the Attlee settlement, all the benefits that our parents had fought for after the Second World War, all of these were precious things. They were things to be looked after. Free education, the National Health Service. The National Health Service is tottering now. It's in a dreadful state.
It was in
a far healthier state when I was a young person and when I was able to use it. I owe the fact that I can walk to the National Health Service, because when I had polio as a small child, the National Health Service was there for me. Now, increasingly, the National Health Service is desperately struggling to cope. It's struggling partly because it's starved of money and partly because it's been forced to turn itself into a market. What my generation did was to pretend that everything, that absolutely nothing would work unless it started to look like a market. Private schools, when I was young, were rapidly becoming...
I feel like what you're doing is wishing for a utopian vision of the world in which nothing ever went wrong. Everybody had all the money that they could possibly want. Everybody was affluent as they could possibly want. And any deviation from that ideal is blamed on the baby boomers. I mean, all governments make mistakes. There is always an economic cycle of boom and bust. There always will be inequality, and it's good that we are trying to address that. But to then suggest, to bring in this conspiracy theory idea that the baby boomers are to blame is quite ridiculous. And Francis, I actually would like to thank you for being a baby boomer. I think you've improved the world immeasurably, and I'm very grateful to you for it.
It's not a conspiracy theory. I'm not part of any conspiracy to do down your generation, but what I am part of is a generation that failed, I think, to protect the enormous benefits that we have been brought. We were the luckiest generation that there has ever been. We inherited a society the like of which Britain had never seen before and has never seen since. I think of the time that when I was young, when I was renting flats in London, I was protected in a way that my children now have to go out and rent flats in London.
Francis, I'm going to have to stop it there because I think this could run and run. In fact, I'm almost quite glad that we didn't have you both in the same studio, although it was very good natured, the generations coming together. Jake Wallis Simons and Francis Beckett, thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.